So, greeting from the BCIS Research Division. We warmly welcome you all to the inaugural session of IR Chit Chat series of BCIS. So, for this inaugural session, we have invited a renowned personality in this field of climate change, transboundary rivers, and Arctic relations. So, we would like to warmly welcome you, Dr. Uttam Sinha. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation to share your valuable insights and under the topic of water for peace and lurking conflict. So let me introduce our resource person for today. Dr. Uttam Sinha is currently a senior fellow at Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses. Dr. Sinha is also a leading scholar and a commentator in this field, and he was also a co-chair of the Think 20 Task Force on Accelerating SDGs, exploring new pathways to the 2030 agenda during the G20 presidency, India's G20 presidency. And also, Dr. has published various widely published various publications in this area as well. So welcome, Doctor. So to start off the discussion, I would like to first start asking how significant do you believe water can be a resource for fostering peace, and also considering the potential shifts in water availability due to the climate change and population growth, how might these future changes impact in the dynamics of peace and conflict in a global scale?
Well, before I answer this riveting question, let me very formally thank you, Maheshi, for your kind introduction. Let me also extend my appreciation to the Bandanaike Center for International Studies for the invitation, particularly Ms. Sindhuja Jayaratne for her initiative. I must say that the BCIS and IDSA, which is now rechristened as the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses, both have a great legacy, your institute, which was set up in 1974, I think is now 50 years old.
Yes.
So this is a remarkable achievement. And the IDSA will turn 60 years next year in 2025. So I'm very happy that, there is this institutional robustness in both Sri Lanka and in India. And I think this is very heartening. And I'm sure the BCIS and IDSA will together work on various collaborative exercises. Now, coming to the question that you've asked, you see, water is what you make of it. It can, on the one hand, be intensely competitive, and on the other hand, it can offer a platform for cooperation, right? And water and peace are inextricably linked, as much as peace and violence is. So as a starting point, one can say that peace is more than just the absence of war or violence. The search, therefore, for governments and states is always for durable and sustainable peace. Now, the development of peace studies, as you all are very familiar, led to the conceptualization of positive and negative peace. Positive peace is peace by peaceful means, like mediation and cooperation and structural integration. Interestingly, and I think we all in South Asia must feel proud about, is that Gautam Siddharth, before he was enlightened, had mediated peace on the Rohini River, the river which now flows from Nepal to India. And there were these two clans, the Sakyas and the Koliyas, and they were fighting over the share of water. And it was Gautam Siddharth who mediated and brought peace on the river. So I think it is a very important civilizational lesson for all of us in South Asia. And I think the world should take this as a very important example that such kind of strong civilizational and ancient sort of values exist in India, right? Negative peace means peace not always by peaceful means. Like elements of coercion, force, bargaining comes into play. Right? So it is clear that water for peace can only come through positive peace and not negative peace. So there is always this space for cooperation, for dialogue, for trust building, for peace building, etc. So why do I say this? Because if you look at the world around you, there are 276 cross-border freshwater basins and about as many cross-border aquifers. More than 3 billion people worldwide depend on water that traverses national boundaries. Yet, out of 153 countries that share water resources with their neighbors, only 24 countries report having cooperation engagements. Peace, therefore, is very tenuous when it comes to sharing water, right? Water has always been, and we all know this because we live with water on a daily basis, it has always been a pressing issue, and one that involves different disciplines. John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, he once said, anyone who can solve the problems of water will be worthy of two Nobel Prizes, one for peace and one for science. And perhaps in the future, there might even be a Nobel Prize for water because it is such a critical, crucial resource for us. Without water, there can be no life. In fact, even Mikhail Gorbachev, after the Cold War, he made a very important speech in the European Parliament in 2009. And he very rightly said that to address the water problems, it has to first become an integral part of the global environment strategy. So, you have to bring in water into the dimensions of development, into the dimensions of sustainable development goals, etc. It is the most critical core element of the global environment strategy. Now, often we hear questions on water war. It is dramatic, but it raises several concerns, especially in South Asia, where water has been a critical element of bilateral relations. But there are more rational voices, more saner approaches in the policy circle, in the government structures, who continue to reinforce water as a catalyst of development. We do not think water as an element of war and of possession, etc., but we value water as a catalyst of development. And I think this is a very important framing of water, an engine to socio-economic progress, and how water can generate additional employment, alleviate poverty and hunger, and improve standard of living of millions of people. But we also know that as the pressure on water mounts and the potential for tension and dispute grows, water for peace becomes a desired objective. Now, what can be done to bring water and peace closer? First and foremost, I think what is required is education and awareness. In fact, a global education network would be most welcome. When we talk about water resources, we have to understand the hydrological cycle or the water cycle as a global common good that transcends, culture and border. So the water cycle is the sum of all processes in which water moves from the land and ocean surface to the atmosphere and back in the form of precipitation. It is elegantly simple, but in its functioning profound. So the hydrological cycle as global common is still just an idea and will require consensus, which will not be easy to come because, often states question issues on sovereignty and accountability. But this is a very good idea to begin with, to talk about the water cycle, the hydrological cycle as a global common. That we are not well informed about the challenges of water leads to faulty actions. Therefore, cooperation on transparent information is vital. And thus, global efforts towards establishing a worldwide information system also becomes very crucial. One very important element of peace is trust, and trust comes from understanding and knowledge. The German philosopher Johann Goethe said that water is a friendly element for those who are familiar with it and know how best to treat it. There are 5 broad characteristics of water that one should be aware of and enlightened about in order to frame well-rounded water policy. The first is water is the largest shared resource in the world. There is no other resource that is shared as much as water is, not even oil. Second, water as a transboundary resource remains by nature unruly, right? And conforms to no unanimously accepted rules. Therefore, the legal elements of water becomes very important. Third, despite this unruliness of transboundary water, states have shown a willingness to cooperate. Right? Some of the world's most implacable enemies have negotiated water agreements. For example, India and Pakistan. Right? The fourth element of water, of knowing what water is that water issues within countries determine water issues between countries. Right? And the fifth element of knowing what water is that water is a resource that is extracted from the ecosystem, a mediated resource, and therefore the law of nature demands that it be returned to what is now referred to as the environmental flow. Right? So we should return back water to nature as we extract from it. So this is the basic fundamental principle of nature itself. Now, I'll make 4 quick observations to complete this question of yours on why water for peace is important. First, given the level of water stress, it is critically important how good water management can contribute to socio-economic development. Second, with increasing urbanization, demand for waters from town and cities will rise significantly. On a per capita basis, an urban resident uses more water than a rural resident. And this is a trend very noticeable in South Asian countries. And you see that across cities in South Asia. And the percentage of urban population will increase in South Asia. So it is important to keep in mind this trend, the rural and the urban. The third element is why water is important for peace is that the water sector cannot be seen in isolation. Right? It is interconnected and interdependent to energy and food. Thus, food, energy, and water forms an inseparable nexus. In fact, it is an existential combination requiring an interdisciplinary approach and multi-stakeholder involvement. And my final point is, water is the key to the future of food, right? But water resources itself is under threat to adequately sustain the world population and end hunger and malnutrition. For example, the world population is estimated to be about 10 billion by 2050. Agriculture production has to grow 50% to meet the rising demands. This would also mean water withdrawals 30% higher than what it is today. So, in the end, to sort of summarize the answer to this question that you've asked, water clearly becomes existential, but is equally driven by political considerations, emotions, and often at times it becomes divisive. And therefore, water and peace and the understanding of that becomes critical for the future of the world.
Yeah, Doctor. So that answer was very informative. Actually, as you correctly pointed out, water is a key element in life, as well as it can be a source for conflicts as well. So, Doctor, I would like to know what are the legal policy frameworks that exist for transboundary water management and allocation?
Well, the legal sphere is always a difficult sphere because there are various interpretations of what the legality of transboundary water is. And there are several legal frameworks, but for me, two particular conventions are important. As I said earlier, water is a transboundary resource that makes water potentially a subject of cooperation. That, however, does not discount the fact that disputes and contestations are inherent in water relations, right? So in the post-Cold War period, when there was peace dividends and institution building, transboundary water resources got an emphasis at the political, legal, and technical levels. For example, the Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes. This is popularly called the Water Convention, and it was adopted in Helsinki in 1992 by the members of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and it came into force in 1996. This was in the post-Cold War period. Now, the convention is quite unique. It is legally binding instrument which promotes the sustainable management of the water resources, and it is fixed to see that the sustainable development goals come alive. It prevents conflicts and it promotes peace and regional integration. And this is very important, regional integration, which we always talk about in South Asia. And it fulfills a lot of the SDG goals, particularly goals like goals 2, 7, 13, 15, 16, and 17. So if you look at the sustainable development goals, a lot of them are related to water. So this is a very important convention, I think. The second convention is on the law of non-navigational uses of international watercourses. Now, in 1997, again, this is post-Cold War, the United Nations General Assembly, in its plenary meeting in 1997, it was in May, I think, adopted this convention and invited states and regional economic integration organizations to become parties to the convention. And it came into force in 2014. Now, both these conventions underline a very important principle: equitable and reasonable utilization of water, right? And it sort of outlines efforts to reduce significant transboundary impact or no harm rule, right? And I think both these water conventions obliges the riparian states to enter into agreements. The water convention said obliges, but the 1997 convention recommends states to conclude specific agreements, right? So both are important in its own way. I think the 1997 convention is interesting in the context of South Asia because as per the voting that happened, the convention was adopted by, I think, a vote of 106 states in favor, 26 abstentions, and 3 against. Now, China, along with Turkey and Burundi, voted against the convention. Amongst the South Asian countries, India and Pakistan abstained, and Nepal and Bangladesh voted in favor, but they have not ratified. Of course, Sri Lanka was not in the picture of things because it did not concern them in terms of the transboundary rivers and waters, right? So I think in the South Asian context, there's a lot of question being asked as to why states in South Asia have not ratified the convention, particularly Nepal and Bangladesh. But I think this is an issue that is constantly raised by Western powers. For India, I think it was important to emphasize that India had already concluded several bilateral treaties much before the 1997 convention. With Nepal, it had signed the Sarda Agreement in 1920 during the British time, the Kosi Agreement and the Gandak Agreement in the 1950s, the Mahakali Treaty in 1996. It signed the Indus Waters Treaty with Pakistan in 1960, and with Bangladesh, it signed the Ganga Treaty in 1996. So these agreements and treaties were a result of bilateral understanding and hinged on the cooperative value of water sharing and benefit sharing. So for India, it was it was important to suggest that we have already incorporated the principles of equitable water sharing and principles of no significant harm. And therefore, the convention was duplicating what India had done.
Okay. Doctor, in this regard, I would like to ask how our water availability and access is distributed in South Asian region, and what are the disparities that are existing to access water resources across the South Asian region?
Yes, there are water in plenty, but there are also scarcity of water in South Asia, and there is also the issue of disparity. So I think it's a huge paradox in South Asia itself. South Asia, if you see the landmass, experiences diverse climatic conditions, ranging from arid regions to areas where there is abundant rainfall. Now, this results in variation in water availability. So South Asia is a home to a large and densely populated region with countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh having some of the highest population densities globally. Now this puts immense pressure on available water resources, which brings in a lot of challenges in ensuring equitable access. And these challenges are defined to a great extent by, as I mentioned earlier, the urban-rural divide. The urban areas in South Asia have better access to piped water supply and improved sanitation facilities as compared to the rural areas. The rural communities, particularly in remote areas, remote parts of the country, rely on traditional water resources such as wells, ponds, or some parts of the river, which may be prone to contamination and seasonal variation in availability. So you can see the difference in the way water is being utilized and consumed in the rural area and the urban sector. South Asia, the mainland South Asia, of course, not Sri Lanka because it is an island. The mainland is a riverine neighborhood. So there are rivers flowing from one country to another. And these are transboundary rivers, and they're shared by multiple countries. So disputes over water sharing and management can arise between upstream and downstream riparian states, impacting access to water resources for different regions and communities, because these are shared rivers. So obviously, if you do not have an institutional mechanism, if you do not have treaties and arrangements, you'll find that different parts and different communities will have less water as compared to others. So there is disparities in access to water resources are also, I think, influenced by the infrastructure development and the governance structures within each country. Investment in water infrastructure such as dams, reservoirs, and irrigation system sometimes disproportionately benefit certain regions or communities over. Socioeconomic factors that includes income levels, education, and social status. All these play a significant role in determining access to water resources. Marginalized groups such as low-income households, indigenous communities, and socially disadvantaged population often face greater challenges in accessing clean and reliable water supplies. So I would say that South Asia presents a paradox of water scarcity and disparity amid abundance, and water disparity for many South Asian is already a reality, and the current situation is only going to get worse. So it remains how governments plan for an uncertain water future, keeping the availability, the access, and the disparity in mind.
So, Doctor, in this regard, how is transboundary water is managed among the South Asian countries, and are there any mechanisms for cooperation and conflict resolution in this regard?
I think this is a very important question. It follows on the footstep of the previous question. South Asia is a very dynamic region in the world. It occupies, as we know, 5% of the world's landmass and about 4% of the world's annual renewable water resources that flows through several river basins in South Asia. South Asia, is often described as crowded, hot, hungry, and a fast evaporating region. That means there's a great emphasis on precipitation and the evaporation of water. Almost 95% of water in South Asia is consumed by the agricultural sector. And when you look at the global average is only 70%. So you can see the dependency of the agricultural sector on water in South Asia. And I think except for Nepal and Bhutan, the per capita water availability is lower than the world average. India is the only country in South Asia that shares the rivers with all its neighbors, thus making it uniquely an upper riparian and a lower riparian countries, right? It's an upper riparian with Pakistan and Bangladesh, but it's a lower riparian with Nepal and Bhutan. So it's a very interesting riparian dynamics. And India's water relations with Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh are a very important part of the regional prosperity and stability. So in view of all this, in view of the growing water challenges in the region, there is a need to understand the political strategic dynamic as well as the several water engagements between India and its neighbors. Now, transboundary rivers in South Asia also acquire political characteristics that results in rivalries and sometimes cooperation. Many of these Himalayan rivers are intimately tied with the issue of territory. So you can imagine the rivers flowing from Kashmir or the rivers from China coming to Arunachal Pradesh, they're very territorial. So in the South Asian context, rivers raise a very important question, whether water can drive greater cooperation between states in the future, or whether it requires intractable political problems to be resolved first before future water cooperation can be achieved. So this is a dilemma that often states in South Asia face. I think cooperation is desirable. No one can deny that. No one can disagree. But it is not easily achievable, given the various factors that come into play when you search for cooperation in South Asia. Often it is influenced by specific historical, political, and economic context, and what is described from the river perspective as a hydropolitical security complex. The politics of negotiation between upstream and downstream countries are determined by who gets how much water and at what time. So there is a tendency, therefore, to exaggerate this equation and introduce the hypothesis of water war. But the increasing interdependencies of water between states in South Asia have proved the war outcome as very, very remote and very unlikely. So the desire is to optimize cooperative arrangements while simultaneously maintaining self-interest, right? Now, in South Asia, there are lots of characteristics that define water treaties. The first characteristic, and a very important one, is that water treaties are both right-based and needs-based. The former, the rights-based, is dominant during the course of the negotiation. In the post-treaty period, issues are more needs-based, right? That is why water treaties in South Asia cannot be seen as final solutions. No, and states continuously have to cope with the changing ground realities. An example of this is the Indus Water Treaty, the Ganga Treaty between India and Bangladesh. There's constantly changes on the ground that put pressures on the treaty. The second defining characteristic of the treaties in South Asia is that both the upper and the lower riparian have stakes in the continuation of the treaty, right? Because India is a strong military and economic power. So when you have a treaty with strong and economic, military strong and economic power, the lower riparian tend to avoid military confrontation, and they emphasize more on mutual benefits of a treaty. So that's what we see in many of the treaties between India and its neighboring countries. The third party is that some of these treaties have used the third party in the water agreements. And one particular one is the Indus Waters Treaty, which the World Bank used its good office to mediate the treaty. But all other treaties in South Asia are purely bilateral, and there is no third party involvement except for the Indus Waters Treaty. So whether river water treaties are conceived as rights-based or needs-based, dispute resolution mechanisms play a very important role in all the treaties in South Asia. And these mechanisms will, of course, require to be strengthened further because we have new hydrological knowledge. And with all this knowledge of river watershed management and the new monitoring technology that is coming in, we should have a new mechanism that can enforce the treaty with lasting values. And lastly, I think an important element of looking at South Asia through the rivers is hydro diplomacy, which is an important subset of regional foreign policy. And the key objective to hydro diplomacy is to sustain cooperative approaches and to address future challenges of transboundary water. And it is important to remember that South Asia is a function of its massive hydrological space. Political boundaries are territorial fixed systems, while rivers actually know no boundaries. So hydro diplomacy reconciles multiple competing uses of water and creates space for integration and cooperation.
Yes. So, Doctor, as a final question, as you explained, transnational water management is a very tricky thing, and also it's very difficult in terms of cooperation as well. So I would like to, as finally, to ask you, what actions can be taken to mitigate potential conflicts in the future in this regard?
Yes. What action can be taken to mitigate potential conflicts in the future? Look, yes. I think we all understand that a stable supply of water is critical for political and economic stability in South Asia. And there can be no denying this fact. And I think we should all be prepared to think about how we can mitigate some of the challenges that will definitely emerge in terms of climate change impact, in terms of growing population, in terms of the non-availability of water resources, etc. What I can think of in terms of some actions are as follows. I would first think that given the nature of politics, the nature of proximity of states in South Asia, I think strengthening dialogue and diplomacy, hydro diplomacy, will be a very important action here to look into some of the challenges of shared water resources in South Asia. That would require, I think, regular communication and dialogue among the riparian states. It's very important, as I said, to build trust, to share information, and therefore to address the concerns related to water resources. Diplomatic channels can be utilized to resolve disputes peacefully and prevent any escalation that might happen. So the first action point, I think, would be really to strengthen dialogue and diplomacy on the transboundary rivers. Second action, I think, is implementing effective legal and institutional frameworks. You had asked the question on the legal conventions. I think these conventions are very useful. We might not be part of those conventions, but I think some of the principles are very important. And our treaties do bring in those principles, but we should keep reflecting on those principles and values and sometimes build new institutional mechanisms, keeping in mind the new knowledge that we have on rivers and river sharing, and try to bring in these elements into our hydro diplomacy. I think the most important thing would be ensuring transparency and accountability in water governance. I think democracy and good governance are very important ingredients when you build legal and institutional frameworks. When you think in terms of ensuring transparency, I think good governance and democracy becomes a very important aspect of that. The third action that I can think of is promoting regional cooperation, encourage collaboration and joint initiatives among the riparian states through regional organization, platform, and forums. Facilitate the exchange of good practices, bring in technical expertise. I think it should not be often left only to the political leaders, but I think also the technical expertise, those who know water, those who know how to best harness river potentials, etc. Capacity building, again, is very important to enhance water governance and management across borders. The fourth action which I think again becomes very important is investing in technology and infrastructure. Projects like dams, reservoirs, irrigation system, they are all very important, as we have seen. But these, these infrastructures should be framed through efficient water use, conservation and distribution. Not necessary that big and mega projects is the only way out. We can also think in terms of, the more medium and the more mini and the more smaller projects that can promote efficient water use. Investing in innovative technologies, for example, water monitoring, forecasting, and sort of looking at water-related risks, because remember, South Asia is also a region which sees floods every year. So I think monitoring and forecasting is again very important, and therefore the use of satellite and the use of science and technology therefore can become a very important action point. My last, I think, point would be, and I emphasize this, is to address the socio-economic development. I had said this in I think the first question that you asked, that water should be framed from a socio-economic perspective, right? And I think addressing socio-economic development is a very important action point to mitigate water challenges, in terms of disparities and vulnerabilities that contribute to water-related conflict, investing in poverty alleviation, education, and livelihood opportunities in water-stressed region. I think all these are very important to reduce dependence on finite water resources and enhance resilience to water scarcity. I think these are some of the action points I can think of, and these actions, together with various stakeholders, can, I think, help in mitigating potential conflicts over transboundary water resources, and thereby, I think, promote peace, stability, and sustainable development in the region.
Well, Doctor, thank you so much for that informative answer. And yes, we also hope that we can build cooperation between the countries through peaceful negotiations on the transboundary water. And thank you very much, sir. And it is very enlightening for us to learn new things about the nexus between the water, peace, and conflict. So thank you very much for joining here with us today for this session. And thank you, sir. So I would also like to thank you all for staying with us, and also stay tuned for the next episodes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.